Because of space limitation, we will be recording the session. We have planned to upgrade our virtual platform to be able to host more participants for future workshops. A few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself on mute throughout the workshop to avoid background noise and interference. And please give us some grace should something go haywire with our virtual platform. Please use the chat feature to ask questions. Melinda Gigante and Pam Fine will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation. As time allows, we will have a Q&A at the end and collect any unanswered questions to answer at a different time. In 2019, the City of Cleveland began an effort to identify middle markets throughout the city and develop stabilization programs to reduce decline and develop these places as mixed income, inclusive, and stable neighborhoods. Our presenter today is Jason Powers. Jason is the project director for the Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods Initiative. In coordination with the City of Cleveland, this initiative is supported by the Cleveland Foundation and is focused on research facing Cleveland's middle neighborhoods and the development of intervention strategies to stabilize and improve these places. In this session, we will learn how the City of Cleveland, in coordination with Case Western Reserve University, has identified edge communities and what programs and policies are under development to maintain them as stable, healthy places for Cleveland's residences and businesses. Prior to his work with the City of Cleveland, Jason was the Director of Marketing and Development at the Old Brooklyn Community Development Corporation. There, he worked with a team on projects to support their middle income community, focusing on place-based marketing, data-driven pilot programs, and a public health lens to community development. Before returning to Cleveland, he worked at NeighborWorks America in Washington, D.C. as the National Public Affairs and Communication Manager, supporting a network of over 250 community development nonprofits. Earlier in his career, Jason served for 5 years as a legislative advisor to Congressman John Oliver, the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on HUD and the Department of Transportation. Jason holds degrees from Indiana University and the City University of London. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason Powers.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you very much. And thank you to Melinda and Pam and everyone at CNP who's been making these possible this year. It's been quite a year. Honestly, I'd very much prefer if we could all be together so that I could really enjoy the room and we could have a real dialogue around this work, because this is also sort of a coming out party for the Middle Neighborhoods work. This is really the first opportunity we've had beyond council conversations and one-on-ones with groups around the city to explore really how this is being heard by all of our partners. So I got a chance to see the guest list and all the people that are here today, and it's extremely exciting, and it's flattering to get this room so full. So we'll get right into this. For those of you who have seen either portions of presentations, some of this is from those other places. For those of you who are new to all of this, I'm going to start with a primer right at the top. So let's get into this. So Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods. What is a middle neighborhood, right? This is the first question we always, of course, are getting. 2.5 years ago, as Colleen mentioned, we held a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank here in downtown, and we invited members of the Middle Neighborhoods group from all over the country. That's really an important starting point, is to understand there are middle neighborhoods initiatives throughout the United States, in Chicago, in Washington, in Baltimore, in Des Moines, in Detroit, in Seattle. And so any concept that can be simultaneously community development in Seattle, Washington, and Cleveland, Ohio, clearly is going to have a diversity of definitions. And so we knew right off the bat that this was going to be less about taking a program and bringing it to Cleveland, and much more about inventing the model for ourselves. And I'm really excited and proud to share that over the last 2 years, we've become really a hotbed of this activity. We've hosted conferences virtually over the last year. We've been called to testify at city councils around the country, discussing this important issue as we've sort of elevated Cleveland's middle neighborhoods work to the front of the conversation. So what is a middle neighborhood? Well, you're looking at one now. You're also looking at one now. These are streets throughout Cleveland. Here's another great example of a very different looking middle neighborhood. And so, middle neighborhoods are something that are very hard to define. But we've got two sort of the godfathers of this work that I'll start with, Paul Brophy and Alan Malik. I like to use these two because if you've ever met Alan, you can appreciate that he's one of those people who thinks, why use 6 words when you can use 16? And so these two definitions were our starting point when I was meeting with council members, when I was having conversations with the public. So, right, these are not places that are thriving, not places that are seeing massive influxes of investment, but they're also not places that are in distress. When you walk down a middle neighborhood street, you kind of feel it. And I know that's not always the most attractive definition, but you start to get a sense of what this really can mean. And I've highlighted something in Alan's definition because I think it's a really critical point. He pointed out that these are places where stabilization and gradual improvement remain, and here's the critical term, realistic strategies. So this is going to be something that I talk about a lot today, and I do it because we need to be careful and thoughtful about how we talk about community development. Community development is something that can and should be done everywhere. It's not a response to challenge. It's not a response to problems. It is something that we do to advance the quality of life of every single resident and every household in a city. And unfortunately, over the last 50 years, community development has mostly been about using HUD programs to try to fight the cycle of poverty and try to provide stable and affordable housing. And so in Cleveland, where we have one of the most mature community development fields that we're extremely proud of, we think differently about this. And we know that with the right tools and resources, we can make communities great places in our region. And so the idea of a place that remains realistic for improvement means that we understand that there are communities where the next generation or two are going to be about reinvention, are going to be about perhaps rooted history and tradition, but the next group of homeowners, the next group of leaders, the next group of people there. But there are communities in Cleveland that still have enough of the rooted presence, that still have enough of the qualities, whether it's physical infrastructure or the community conversations and block clubs and sort of that soft power component. And those things really are still close to stability. And so that's where middle neighborhoods comes in. And this is really important because of this issue, CDBG. Anyone in our Cleveland region, really, if you work in community development, CDBG is clearly, it's a 4-letter word, right? And so every year people get a little anxious around this. In a former life, I worked for the appropriator for HUD in the House of Representatives. And we were the ones writing the number in for what CDBG allocations looked like. And one thing that I've learned since working in community development is that at the City of Cleveland, the amount of money that we can put into our communities through the HUD CDBG grant is an order of magnitude larger than any other community investment strategies that we have in Cleveland. So let that sink in. The federal funds really are the vast majority of what we use every year to do the things that our field is focused on. And so this number is really important, but as you can see here, we've got a graph that took six legacy cities, very similar to Cleveland, and it aggregated their CDBG allocations from 1975 to 2014. And so when you hear people talk about this year's allocation being steady, right? I think this year's is the same as last year's. Or they talk about maybe a small increase or a small decrease, as though that sort of helps us understand where the funds are going and what we can expect. Take a look at what happens when you adjust for inflation. Now, what you can see is that clearly we've been in a steady decline really since the onset of the program. Now, this line is directly incongruent with the quality of life of our residents. Since 75, we would say that the distress factor has only increased in these communities. There are more and more communities that have greater and greater need, and yet we are seeing fewer and fewer resources deployed in these communities. So what does this have to do with middle neighborhoods? Well, in a city of Cleveland, right, around 38 or so neighborhoods, if we have communities that really do need the most support, we need these resources from HUD, the CDBG, the affordable housing, the supportive components to be allocated to these places. And yet we are only seeing gradual increases in areas where the need continues to grow. We see the shrinking of stable communities. We see the leaving from these communities out into the suburbs, the exodus. Then we're only going to have a greater need. And so the idea of finding places where we can stop, where we can stabilize and we can work to deploy resources that are slightly more private oriented, that are at times much more focused, Our effort is meant to allow for the CDBG funding, to allow for the federal funding, to allow for state funding whenever it comes or however it comes, to be deployed where it's absolutely necessary. So former director Tanya Maness, now our leader at CNP, and I often talked about this concept of a spectrum of programs. We know that our increasingly invested communities where we're seeing housing prices go up exponentially, in some places we're seeing displacement. We know that we need policy solutions for the challenges there, and we also need to find ways to take advantage of this incredible growth. We know what distressed communities need. The question became, what are the middle neighborhoods? Where are we going to work, and what do they need? And so if you've met with me over the last year, and a lot of people on our call have, you've heard me say that I hate the term middle neighborhoods. I think I'm allowed to say it as the project director. Middle neighborhoods really is innocuous. It's a very difficult thing to pinpoint. So I really like to talk about what's the issue with these places. And I think that the best word to describe them is the gap. And so, when you think of places in Cleveland, whether you're a practitioner in the city or whether you work throughout our region and you're thinking about first suburbs and other places, think about places where there's a gap in perceptions and reality. Right? Think about places where you know these streets, you know the schools, you know the neighborhoods, and you know that these are really wonderful places to live. I live in one of them. I know my friends and colleagues live throughout the city of Cleveland in places that we know are great. And yet not a single one of us goes a week or a month talking about our job to friends and not hearing about the misunderstanding, the gap in perceptions. But the problem is it's not just a conversation or an argument or a discussion. It leads to real consequences as disinvestment follows. Because at the end of the day, and you'll hear me say this a lot this morning, what we're dealing with is a non-growing region. We're dealing with a region where the population is roughly stagnant, and yet the supply of housing continues to grow and expand further out. And the incentives to buy further out and to get further away from older housing stock only grows. And so without higher demand in these communities, we see decline. And this is something we've learned over the last 2 years, but I think a lot of people understand this anecdotally. There is a price point where the home is too invaluable, right? Where the home has too low of a value. Jason Segedy, who's the director of planning in Akron, and I often talk about this issue, and he had a very thoughtful article about this a couple of years ago, riffing on that candidate for president who referenced the rent is too damn high, if you remember him. Well, he wrote an article based on a Forbes article that was called the rent is too damn low. And it was a reference to the cost of housing starting to tip into a level where it no longer appeals to the average buyer, where even lower income and working class incomes can purchase homes in other places. When you hit this level as a median in your neighborhood, the neighborhood itself starts to show that it can't hold value. And this is where we get blocks after blocks after blocks that look different every 5 or 10 years. They're slowly starting to decline. But over the last 20 years, if you look at places, you talk to neighbors, you get a sense of what's going on, you can see how significant the change has been. This leads to gaps in community engagement, right? And so as we see fewer homeowners and we see more renters, as we see community development organizations in neighborhoods deal with getting the cat out of the tree, as my former director used to say, right? Putting the fires out. The issues of really the grassroots of connecting neighbors, of providing a forum, of allowing people to really share ideas and connect starts to dwindle, which leads to a gap in civic pride. We're proud of our neighborhoods because we know our neighbors, because we love walking under beautiful canopies to parks and going to that local neighborhood shop. Civic pride is something that in the city of Cleveland, we know our neighborhoods can often provide in ways that our suburban counterparts can't. So as we see gaps in community engagement grow, they lead to this other challenge. And last but not least, and sadly, we live in a capitalist society where every dollar is really the answer to most questions. There's gaps in public investment. We just showed in that previous slide the overall decrease in federal funding for communities. As gaps in public investment continue, as they dry up, as the city of Cleveland continues to see less and less revenue when it comes to challenging incomes, when we hit snags, when we hit devastating years like the past year, where potentially municipalities can see enormous gaps, and should we not have had a federal stimulus come to support us, that leads to gaps in public investment. And as most of us know in our field, and it's frustrating sometimes, but the public investment really is what inspires the private investment. Private investors are never going to be the first in. They will often be the ones with the biggest margins, but it's the public investment that is so critical. And so let's get into an example. We're going to talk a lot about the suburbs, the first suburbs, the general sort of non-Cleveland municipalities of our region. And that's not to say that this is an antagonistic relationship. I work very closely with a lot of great people in community and housing work in our first suburbs. But at the end of the day, especially when you're in a non-growth region, you need to be competitive. And the city of Cleveland is severely lacking in competitive neighborhoods for middle-class, quality, stable housing. And so let's take a look at a place that we consider to be one of our middle neighborhoods, Bel Air Puritas. And let's take a comparison to Lakewood, which is just a little bit north over 90. Now, we were talking about those gaps in perceptions, those gaps in investment, and you can see, and anyone from our region knows that Lakewood is having an incredible decade. Lakewood is seeing that there is no gap in perception, there is a surplus in perception. Lakewood is a great place to live. I have friends that live there, and I certainly don't disagree that it's a wonderful place. I would point out that I think you have these moments of exuberance, right? And it just sort of continues like dominoes to develop into a place where the excitement about a place takes over. And so the physical value of these two homes, these theoretical 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, 1935 bungalows, the bricks and sticks are about the same value, but the land value based on the demand is going to be higher in Lakewood. The neighborhood value, that perception, that civic pride, that marketing, je ne sais quoi, right? Those things that make you not sure of why you love this place, but it's there, are exceptional right now in places like Lakewood. And so the sticker price on the home is going to be different. Let's imagine now that both homes are purchased and invested in. And we all know that flipping is sometimes considered a bad word, but we're just going to talk about private investors, buying a home, investing in a home, and selling a home. And so as you can see here, both homes received the same kind of investment, same kind of sinks and tile and roof. But when you go to do the post-rehab appraisal, when you go to sell the home, we have gaps in our communities. Now, this is something we'll talk about later with particular policy elements. The Cleveland has a construction gap financing program modeled after a number of other CGF programs throughout the country. And it's an important, if not essential tool. But I bring this up to show yet another example of the gap. And as we all know, where there is a gap like this, naturally, there isn't going to be an investment. This rehab in Bel Air Puritas won't take place because it won't pencil out. And yet the investment dollars will continue to flood where there's profit. This profit will lead to extreme pricing over time, and we'll see these concentrations of wealth and slow decline. And so we have concentrations of poverty and distress, concentrations of wealth in growth or gentrifying places. And in the middle, we have this slow decline. So here's another sort of gap, if you will. We have strong market activity in those places that we all know about. We have extremely disinvested communities on the other side. But if you walk the blocks of Cadell, you walk the blocks of Lee Harvard, it'll be block by block. You'll go from one street where there's a beautiful canopy and homes that all have recently updated exteriors and well manicured lawns. And then you'll go a couple of streets down and you'll see a street that looks like a completely different neighborhood. And there's always an anecdotal reason. Those of us in community development, we know that sometimes this is as much as just a couple of seniors moving out and a couple of homes changing over. It doesn't take a lot for a street to start to see that precipitous decline. And so because of that, we also know that as we started to ask, where do we do the work? We needed to be very meticulous and use sort of a scalpel approach to find the places we're going to work in. And you'll notice I use a lot of demand and supply conversations in this. Again, it's an economics conversation because we're talking about, at the end of the day, where can the city of Cleveland put as few resources as it has and expect there to be a return, expect these properties to really see long-term investments, because we know there are places where we can make an investment today and 10 years from now, we'll be facing the same challenges. And then there are places where that same investment amount will actually spur growth and spur change. I won't go too deep into this slide because we all know what we're dealing with. This started in the 1950s as the suburbs started to grow out. But this is our cycle that we're dealing with, and it continues each time. And so a neighborhood where the homes were at one point the most attractive in our entire region, they simply saw attraction grow in brand new homes and housing in the communities outside of the city. And when you have 10 people bidding on one home, we all know that you get the best possible price. If you don't have many people bidding on homes in a community, the prices decline. An interesting conversation we had with some realtors that I thought was enlightening as a home buyer myself was around the idea of signaling from price. And so you would often think when you're looking and buying that sometimes the less expensive option is going to be very attractive. But if anyone's ever gone to a store and considered options, we, as behavioral economists have shown, we see that a higher price often signals to us better quality. It's not always the case. These are perceptions. But what happens is that as prices dwindle, as prices decline, as we see homes languish, on our Zillow accounts that we've starved for a while, it sends a signal to buyers that this isn't the kind of neighborhood that they want to buy a home in. And that's because of the myth or the truth of the American middle class, which is that home ownership is integral to wealth building. Now, I'll take a moment to pause here and say that we all know that that's a conversation that's specific to white America. Wealth building over the last century, especially specifically when it comes to the housing market, has been really the purview of white Americans able to buy homes wherever they were able to buy and see appreciation. And so when we've been looking at our neighborhoods and when we look at home values, we have to take into account not only the historic redlining, but the de facto redlining that continues to occur in these communities. We see communities that are identical to other geographies and other parts of the city with different demographics that are 10, 15, and sometimes 20% lower in values. In fact, we'll see them adjacent to suburbs where the prices are even higher than their alternative middle neighborhoods with a majority white community. And so when we look at what we're doing to do interventions, we not only want to be equitable in how we provide further and additional support, but we don't want to just bring more resources. We want to tackle the problems. And so we're looking at ways to deal with the appraisal gaps specifically in these communities. And so to finish up the cycle of decline, once you've gone through this cycle, one generation in the 50s and 60s, it doesn't stop there. That filtering continues until we see neighborhoods fully distressed. We see neighborhoods that are declined into the middle or further down. And I want to make sure that we all know that there's no such thing as a middle neighborhood typology, really. It's a snapshot. In 2021, it looks different than in 2001. It looks different than 1981. So all of this leads to the conversation around who's spending money in these communities. In the middle markets, and you'll see the distinction momentarily, in the middle markets, we have places like the first suburbs that are stronger. We see places where home buyers are coming in, where there's 3, 4, 5, 7 bids on a property. And that's showing attraction, that's showing investment, that's showing demand. We see for-profit developers that see an opportunity. So they'll do the rehabs like we showed in the example a moment ago in Lakewood. And of course, we'll see new construction, which is sort of the unicorn in most of the middle neighborhoods of Cleveland. Lumber prices aside, over the last year, we all know that new construction has a fixed cost. It is considerably more expensive than the rehab market, simply because in the rehab market, if you can find cheap acquisitions, then you can make a very healthy quality home available at a lesser price. But new construction is another signal. It sends a message to the market that there's investment going on, and it provides incredibly important inventory. We have conversations all the time with millennials, right, who are supposed to save our cities. And we all know the truth is that the vast majority of this generation is still moving to the suburbs, is still moving to where they grew up. Cleveland seems to not follow that same sort of pattern as many of the growing cities. And we don't think that's because of any real differences in Cleveland. We think that the reality is we just haven't hit that tipping point where the investment in community shows. There's only a few places in Cleveland that are consistently seeing investment. And so this is really important. We need to find policies and tools to attract investors. Here's just a visualization of what that gap can look like. On the left, you can see a home sold probably a few years before the peak. It's a double. Pretty good price point in a really nice, stable street in the old Brooklyn community of Cleveland. And as you can see on the right, it ended up going to sheriff's auction. It was a tax foreclosure. It went to an LLC out of state. This is a story that everyone who works in the housing field knows is more than, it's considerably reoccurring in all of our communities. But if you look here, just a few years later, the home shows what you would imagine from property owners that are not really responsible for the quality of life at that home. Collecting checks, collecting a stream of incomes for other investors. Their mission is to turn an asset in Cleveland not into a home in a neighborhood or a community. Their mission is to turn it into an asset, just like a stock or a bond or some other equity. They believe in a purchase price, a stream of cash flows, and they don't care if 10 years from now the house falls over. That is something that our governments can't seem to stop. That is something that we don't have really tools to completely eliminate. There are examples. For example, Detroit has worked to expand the moratorium on tax foreclosures indefinitely beyond the 2020 pandemic. There are ways that we can consider legislation, but those are only going to solve parts of our problem. I also want to be clear that on the picture on the right, the residents of this home could be phenomenal members of the community. There's absolutely no reason that the people in this story are better or worse. But that house, we can all agree, is less of an interesting place to live across the street from than the one on the left. So this is really a conversation around place. We're very excited. I need to make a quick side note that we are working with Cleveland State University, the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, and CSU through a Robert Woods Johnson Foundation grant to study the effects of people in these middle communities, specifically low and moderate income households, and how living in middle neighborhoods affects the quality of life and the outcomes for low income families. The idea is that when we talk about mixed income communities, that modest and middle class neighborhoods tend to be places that can both support lower income and also attract higher income households to the same place. And in Cleveland, we have such a wealth, maybe even a surplus, if you will, of these housing communities, these areas where there's blocks and blocks of modest homes, that we should be able to work on that. And I think many of us would agree that the mixed income community is sort of the holy grail of community development and community engagement work. So we want to find ways to do that, and we'll be studying that with CSU. The last thing I'll talk about in this section about sort of what is a middle neighborhood is one of the qualities that we found really significant in Cleveland. So I know we all think Cleveland is unique. We all think Cleveland is special. I'm part of that conversation. But when we have conversations with our colleagues throughout the country, something did stand out, which was this issue of affordability with sort of a lowercase a. So when we talk about affordability, oftentimes we're discussing federal affordability standards. We're talking about Section 8 housing. We're talking about federally supported housing, LIHTC. That's a conversation about federal affordability. There's another one, which is just the word we all use when we talk about, not being able to afford something or being able to afford something. It means within your current income and your current budget, you can purchase something. And so we took a look at a lot of the neighborhoods we were examining, and we took a look at the average incomes. And then we worked with some banks to kind of come up with an equation, a reasonable debt to income ratio to approach a mortgage. And when we did this work, what we found was that in a lot of these places, the incomes in the communities themselves were more than able to afford the average home in these communities. And so if you see here, we've got a census tract from Old Brooklyn, one of those sort of quintessential middle neighborhoods. Taking the gross income average in that census tract, we were able to extrapolate sort of a maximum debt load that would be reasonable. And when we were able to do the math, what we found was that the housing cost of a $135,000 bungalow or A-frame in that community was really sort of maxing out the debt. In this very community, the median sale price for arm's length transactions was $78,000 that year. So almost half the maximum affordability. Now, as I mentioned before with Jason Zegedy's article, that's probably too low. That price is probably caused because there weren't enough buyers, because there wasn't enough demand, and because as a result of that, the home will have deferred maintenance, and over time will be not just not an attractive home, but it won't be a healthy home. However, that being said, we know that there's a lot of room between the median price and this maximum price. And so in that gap, in that spread of options, we see the affordability possibility. Now, one last thing, why is this happening? Why is that demand so low? Well, we already know we're in a no growth scenario, but the other thing is we have better incomes in Cleveland than we have housing values. I'll say that again, because when we think of our fair city, we often think of low income. We often think of the challenge of purchasing power. We have compared to our region, we have stronger incomes than we have housing values. And that's because where incomes are in the middle, they leave. They don't buy the homes locally. So what you're looking at is an example of perhaps a family of four that is renting a home and is ready to purchase their first home out in Berea, out in Maple Heights. What you're seeing is a family that is perhaps owning their first home. And when they look to buy the next home, perhaps it's because there isn't a sizable home, right? There isn't the 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom that everyone's looking for. But there also may not be a home that they want in the neighborhood that they're looking in. And so we are seeing that slow bleeding of income out to the suburbs, leaving us with a situation where over time, the lowest incomes will remain, the home values will continue to fall. So that is the challenge of a middle neighborhood, that steady decline into distress. And that's where we'll take our first pause this morning. I'm going to try to allow for any questions that might come up in sections to be asked as we go. So if you have a question, you want to throw it into the question box, go ahead now. And I'll just talk for a moment. Otherwise, we'll continue on to the next section, which is going to be about sort of how we in Cleveland define middle communities.
Again, folks, if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat. Jason, thanks for a strong start. Yeah, I was going to say, take a sip of water. We're so excited to have you with us today. Doesn't look like there's anything in there. So if you want to go ahead, keep going.
We'll continue, everyone. Okay, so that's our sort of primer on the general concept. So what does that mean in Cleveland? As I said, Cleveland's unique, right? We're special. So I'm going to break the cardinal sin of presentations, and I'm going to read from a slide, and it's going to be a lot of text. But I found this to be such a well-written and concise description of what we are dealing with. And so what you can see here, this is from a 2014 study done by CSU on regional housing challenges. And so what they said was from 1960 to 2010, a total of 623,000 housing units were created in the metropolitan area. The number of households only increased by 336,000. So this is what we're talking about with that cycle of decline. We made almost twice as many new homes, brand new construction, new units of housing to the population growth in our region. And that, of course, causes a really significant challenge because, for one thing, we obviously have a lot of opportunities to move out. But additionally, with that massive supply and not nearly the demand you might expect, the housing values themselves remain depressed. And so certainly the developers aren't making a lot on those new homes compared to other regions, but also it's really attractive. So moderate income or upper income families can buy a lot of house in our region. I keep saying this and I'll keep saying this. It's just too cheap. Cleveland is an incredibly affordable region. And so when we attract out of town businesses, when we attract new talent, when people come to Cleveland, they can typically afford throughout our county in almost 73% of municipalities, the 60% AMI can at the median. So that's almost everywhere in our region you can buy a home if you're making just above the median income. The great majority of people who moved during that time moved up and out. So 88% of Cleveland movers during this time period and 78% of that first ring moved further out and were in many cases buying new and more expensive homes. And so this is the story in 2 sentences of the 20th century in Cleveland and suburban sprawl. And so the effect of this was that households of all incomes, low income, working class income, middle income, and upper income, they basically selected the best situation they could afford. We all know what this is like. If we are fortunate to have choice in our housing market decisions, we start with a list. Maybe it's geographical, maybe it's school system oriented. But once we've got a couple of those things pegged, we just look for the best house for our dollars. And as a result, the bottom of the market, those that were left behind, were unrentable, abandoned, and destined for demolishment. We've seen this on our southeast side. We've seen this really throughout parts of Cleveland. It was devastating in the 2000s as sort of we came to a culmination of this dynamic. Lastly, while the early years of suburban migration, many of the families were replaced by largely African-American families that were moving out of substandard housing into these communities. But over the last 25, 35 years, as the continued, I drew the cycle of decline a moment ago, continued, families that could move out did move out. And as that continued, there's an increasing undermining of middle neighborhoods, one after the other. And so that's why I talk all the time about this being sort of a temporal thing. This is a time thing. This is a migration story. The middle isn't a place. I don't expect a middle neighborhood to look that way forever. And if we stabilize it, I still don't expect it to be similar forever. Instead, a middle neighborhood is just a moment where a community is neither expanding aggressively, where there isn't massive influxes of values, nor is it declining. It's a stable place. And there is data that shows that this is something that can be long-term. We'll talk about that in a moment, that there really is a long-term story here of affordability. So I mentioned a moment ago that incomes are actually better than housing values, which is not always something we think about. Here you can compare the 80 to 120 range of incomes in the city of Cleveland to our region, right? So here's our AMI. And as you can see, we're at, just a little bit above the halfway of our incomes. But here's our housing values. So the average home value in the city of Cleveland is 1/3 that of our region. And so this is that story of the naturally occurring affordable house. And this is why I said in Cleveland, it is so dramatic. Only Detroit really mimics this pattern. And while I love Detroit, and we all know from a community development standpoint that we have so many things in common, this is one of the things I prefer we didn't have in common. So as you can see here, half the metro area income, but 1/3 the home value. The incomes are outpacing the home values, which means it doesn't mean that people have incredible opportunities to buy great homes in Cleveland. It means that they're leaving. It means that they're buying with that income outside of Cleveland, and the decline is continuing. Just for comparison, some of the gentrifiers, right? The lead cities, I guess, if that's your thing, Seattle, San Francisco, take a look. In Seattle and San Francisco, the median household income in the city is basically the same as its region. So you're making the same whether you're in the suburbs or the city. In Washington, D.C., the city has a lower income. Now, there's part of the reason for that is the dynamic that D.C. was a much more heavily lower income city just 15 years ago. But regardless, the opposite here is true, where home values in the city are considerably higher. Now, we don't want to necessarily see extreme value growth. We don't want to see the gentrification that we talk about in these cities. But we do need to understand that attracting people to the city is how we're going to be able to have communities that are stable. So when we started talking about where in Cleveland we wanted to work, we knew that we were having a conversation around competition. And so we needed to do a regional conversation because at the end of the day, South Euclid and Collinwood are in competition for the residents. The migration out of Lee Harvard is to Bedford or Maple Heights. These are not just anecdotes, this is data that is showing where people are choosing to buy. So what we did was we took a look at the regional housing market. And as you can see here on price per square foot, we have a number of Cleveland neighborhoods and a number of our suburbs. And this was probably the magic sauce, if you will, of the middle neighborhoods work in Cleveland. We brought together some researchers from the Federal Reserve and from the Center of Community Progress and NeighborWorks. We started having a conversation to understand this dynamic of stability. What is a stable community? Is it a place where the prices are following inflation? Is it a place where the prices are growing at a certain rate, where there's a lot of a velocity of sales? And we wanted to figure out if there was a way to sort of identify them quantitatively, right? We at some point need to start with a big map of the region. And so what we did was we took a look at scenarios. We looked in Collinwood, we looked in Cadell, we looked in West Park, and we looked at where we could find a scatter of home sales at the same time, at least 7. And what the data showed was very interesting. In communities, as prices declined, so the median price came down, there was a smaller variance in the prices. So what I mean by this is in places where the median was $65,000, you would see 10 homes for sale and they were selling between $58,000 and $77,000. But in places where the homes were selling at a median of $180 a square foot, we saw homes selling for $60,000 and homes selling for $360,000. And what we started to recognize was that was showing that a market was actually active. If you have ever gone to buy a home and you see 5 or 6 homes and you start to recognize that the homes look very different. In one home, everything has been updated and it's nice and it's clean. And in another home, the kitchen is falling apart and the front porch is sagging. In one home, they've got a brand new kitchen and they've added a bathroom in the basement. In another home, the roof is going to definitely need a tear off and replacement yesterday. And yet, sometimes you'll see that the prices are very similar. This was something that we saw time and time again in our edge and middle markets. And what this showed us was that there simply was too few buyers in the market. We didn't see this as stability, right? This was decline. On the other hand, where you saw that prices were really spreading out, we knew that this was because of increased demand. We knew that this marked a variety of construction options. We knew that there were places that were seeing multiple bids on homes that were about to be rehabbed. We knew that this meant that there were multiple bids on homes that had been rehabbed. And at the end of the day, that gap we showed between Bel Air, Puritas, and Lakewood, where the purchase of a home and the investment of a home should create profit opportunities, the gaps were consistent where neighborhoods were in decline. And that's just because at the end of the day, the demand wasn't there. People were not interested in living in these places. And so we needed to find, and I want to be more thoughtful about that last sentence. There are definitely people that are buying homes in these communities, but there aren't enough people investing in these communities. And what we're doing is we're losing them, not to home buyers and not even to local landlords who want to turn them into rentals for their portfolio, but we're losing them to bulk buyers who don't even live in Ohio, sometimes the United States. Anyone who works in housing knows this. We are losing the battle because we have this incredibly cheap asset that is undervalued. And so around $100 to $125 a square foot median was where we started to see the market spread properly and stability occur. And we use that as a way of finding our stable markets. Now, that doesn't mean they're unstable above. It just means that on the other side of this equation, where you see Beechwood and Rocky River and Ohio City, what you're seeing is investment taking off. Think of it this way. There are some times when you own a house and you think, man, I really want to put a back porch on. And then you think, well, I'm never going to get that money back. And then there's times when you have friends who own a house and they put something into their kitchen and they updated a bathroom and then they got it refinanced and they've got even more equity than they had before. And so I talk about this a lot. The housing market is sort of the everyman's stock market. Most people don't understand quarterly earnings or derivatives and all these things we got into trouble in the 2000s with. But when I talk to my neighbors, they all notice when there's a dumpster in a driveway and someone's getting their roof replaced. Everyone notices when someone's house goes on Zillow, and we all kind of gossip about that conversation. Or what are they going to get for it? That's what I mean when I say the everyman's housing market. And it shows that people understand the value of their properties. And if they don't see that that value is stable or increasing, then they're not interested in that community. It's a really important component to just the neighborhood quality of life. And so in orange, you see the suburbs, many of them obviously outside of our market. And when we remove them, we get the Cleveland housing market. And this tells our story. So the question is, where are Cleveland's middle neighborhoods? And the answer is they're missing. To our West Park friends, I want to be clear, these are neighborhood boundaries. And so obviously there are portions of West Park that are actually above the stable line, and there are portions of West Park that are well below it. And it's the same throughout lots of these neighborhoods on both sides of our graph. Our neighborhoods are enormous. We'll talk about that later. But the point is still true that the majority of Cleveland's geography is either thriving or it is seeing gaps or in distress. And so we needed to decide as a program where we wanted to focus. And this kind of made it easy for us, to be honest. We knew that we were going to focus in sort of the best in breed of those declining places. I mentioned a moment ago that stability is a snapshot, but the snapshot can be lengthy. And so I wanted to point out here that between 1953 and roughly 2001, adjusted for inflation, that sort of Goldilocks range of stable neighborhood was affordable by the middle class and consistently available. So these are the average home prices nationwide. And they stayed roughly stable and in that range for all of the last half century. Until, of course, we saw the housing bubble in the 2000s. And then, as many of us know, and some of us are concerned, the new housing, whether it's a bubble or just a housing inflation, we don't know. But to put everyone's concerns a little bit aside, Cleveland, as I said before, is maybe too affordable. So there's your national trend line. That second increase is going on. Take a look at our county numbers, just below $100 a square foot, really right at that stability point. The suburbs really in the thick of that point. And then Cleveland pulling up the rear, lagging far behind. So when we talk about inflation, we know that this is a story really going on in our first ring suburbs. So we now know what we're looking for in Cleveland when we talk about middle neighborhoods. And this conversation has really impacted a lot of our sister cities that we work with, because they've started to talk about edge neighborhoods a lot more. We need to be working right where we think we can make change with limited resources. So I'll allow for questions if there are any, and we'll take another moment. This is the challenge of being on Zoom instead of in a room with everyone. I could just stare down the people I know, the plants that I made earlier. But we'll keep going.
Thanks, Jason.
Yes, absolutely. So where do we start? So I said neighborhoods are a challenging point. Baltimore is our sister city in all of the work we do. We've been working on some joint programs. We've been learning a lot from them. Quite honestly, we've been stealing a lot of their best ideas. What I learned that I thought was so exciting about Baltimore is it's a city of 600,000 people, and yet they have 277 neighborhoods. Those are their SPAs down in City Hall, and the way that people kind of consider where they live. Right, so we're at 400,000, 385,000 or so, and around 35 to 40 neighborhoods, depending on how you slice parts of our communities. So when we talk about neighborhoods in Cleveland, we know that we have really, really big places. And so if I was going to allocate $5 million to a neighborhood, it would go like that. We also got council wards, of course, our CDC boundaries. Thank you to Nina Holzer for this beautiful map. Census tracts gets a little better, right? We're starting to get out of the political boundaries, and we start to get much more finely honed. But we've got one better, and I'm excited about this because the tool that I'm going to be showing you, and this tool that we hope will be really a mainstay of analysis and investment thought in Cleveland moving forward for years, it goes down to the block group level. And so that conversation I was mentioning about the streets of Lee Harvard going block by block, what you see is that we need to get granular. And so we started developing this thing we call the Neighborhood Development Index. This is a tool that we've been designing with Case Western Reserve University. As we all know in our region, we have, if nothing else, we have an incredible wealth of data, and we wanted to take advantage of that. And so we sort of mirrored a tool that is used in 43 other cities around the country called the MVA, the Market Value Analysis tool. We knew we could do it a little bit better and with local talent. And so we started designing it. This is an old iteration, so don't start taking notes on the colors. But this is what it allows us to do. I talk about showing up at the doctor and saying, my elbow hurts. That's a bit of information. But when you take an X-ray or an MRI even, you can really start to see what's going on. And so the more data we can pull, the more we can sort of see our neighborhood slightly differently. And if you didn't know Cleveland, and I just showed you this image, and I asked you to start talking about what these places might need, what they might look like, what they might be experiencing, and I maybe gave you a little bit of information about what the key meant, you could get a sense of these places, and you might even start to have sort of a hypothesis of development around this. It also showed us that this issue of migration means that there's opportunity. So here's the border of Lee Harvard and Warrensville and Shaker, Maple Heights to the south there. And what it shows is that Cleveland and its boundaries around it look almost identical. And it shouldn't make any confusion to people, because oftentimes when families and households live in these communities, they don't want to move too much further from their family, from their church, from the various community activities they're a part of. And so when we looked at these areas, it made sense that not only were these similar in terms of the economies and the data, what it was showing, but these are the stories of the people were actually very similar right across these boundaries. This became very important and is really critical. Any of our colleagues on the call who are from our financial services industry, the banks that work in our regions, you know me. We've been talking for a while about what our next steps will be to get better and stronger investment in these neighborhoods. When we had these conversations, it was really helpful to be able to say, look, Cleveland's perceptions are just wrong. And you can see it here. The data shows you that these communities look the same. And here's a neighborhood that I think wins the prize for the most submarkets. So this is this enormous 6 square mile community of Old Brooklyn. It actually has more submarkets in it based on the most recent analysis, and you'll see that actually at a later point in the presentation. But in all of these areas, the CDC is doing its job. The neighborhood knows itself as Old Brooklyn, and yet it is incredibly different block by block by block. And so we knew we needed to get into the weeds on this, and we developed this tool. So the NDI started with 177 variables that eventually went into the matrix. Computers took all of that information and said what really mattered. So we're talking everything from the density of canopy to the number of water main infractions that the water department had been able to collect in a particular area, to the scale of walkable retail in an area, because we weren't just looking for what was happening in the moment. We wanted to find out what the potential was. We did health department certificates for commercial kitchens. We were really looking for every possible data point. And then, of course, we know that not everything really tells the story. There might be two places that have very similar scale of homes, but might have very different economies within them. And so the computer did its initial analysis and came back with something called the principal component analysis. And I promise I won't get too deep into this, but I also am very data oriented and love this part of the conversation. So I'd be happy to set up meetings with anyone on the call and really get more deeply into this. Also, this is going to become a public tool. We're still working out how to host it and a lot of those kind of components with the city. But as we get to that place, everyone's going to be able to play around with this. So the four principal components were the value indicators, which is, again, housing values are really indicative of a lot of the ways we can sort of describe a place. But we wanted to go further. So structural indicators. How old was the average home? How many bedrooms on average in that place? Bathrooms, things that people are absolutely looking for. My personal favorite, and I think this is sort of an interesting sort of component to all of this, was we created an index to determine the diversity of housing stock in an area. So if you think about some block groups, 99% of homes are 1940s A-frames. Some blocks, it's 1960s ranches. But there are places in Cleveland where the small area, you could walk maybe a circle of a half mile, and you're going to see some 1960s build, some 1930s build, maybe the occasional 1890s farmhouse, and you'll see some 1990s construction. There were places like this in the city of Cleveland. Not a lot, but what we realized was if we're talking about demand, we're talking about competition, we need to be able to offer families a variety of housing options. And so this index score became really a big piece of the final scoring metrics. Distress indicators and then neighborhood indicators. We talked again about walkability. Just because there's a commercial corridor in your block group that has a lot of vacancy doesn't mean it's a negative necessarily, because we're talking about 25 years from now what this community could look like. Hopefully 5-10 years from now what this community could look like. So these are aspirational indicators. And this is what we got. Like I said, we will be putting forward a public version of this so everyone can take a look. So don't you can screenshot it, I suppose, but this is what our county's market typology looks like. The A through I is relevant just unto itself. So these are cohorts. So all of the places that are A's, D's, G's, it means that they're similar. There is something that the computer is telling us that these areas are similar. We're going to talk a lot about suburbs and neighborhoods in the same breath. And so I want to be clear, when you look at this image, what you can see is Parma Heights and Old Brooklyn. Right? You can see Fairview Park and West Park. You can see Collinwood and Euclid. And you can see that stretching between places, that migration story. And what it means is that these places are similar. You can also see Strongsville, Independence, and Lyndhurst. So there's a lot of us who have grown up maybe outside of Cleveland or know the suburbs from family and friends. We know that some of these places seem like you could get lost in them because they look just like other places. And yet, because they're part of municipalities and within the borders of our traditional way of thinking of these places, we don't think of how we pursue policy in these places for those only. Instead, we think of these places as part of Cleveland Heights, or we think of them as part of Bay. And so here you can see the city of Cleveland's borders. City of Cleveland actually has every single typology except for one. It obviously has a lot more of some of them, but that's really important. Again, Cleveland, really does have a lot of opportunities. And I would say this to anyone, if we were simply growing as a region, if I could snap my fingers and we had massive influx of jobs and growth, the city of Cleveland will be looking a lot like some of our, St. Louis and Pittsburgh, these places where there's a lot of vibrance going on in a lot of these neighborhoods. And so really it's a story of not of what we don't have, rather than what we do have. So let's start with the stable markets, because that's what the middle markets are going to be about. Here's our region. I like to show it without any borders because it kind of makes you sort of squint and think about what we're looking at. So these are within that 100 to 125 range. This was the F cohort. And as you can see here, we see West Park, portions of it, and a few parts of Old Brooklyn. And then really these first suburbs on the west side and a little bit on the east side. So this was a cohort of similarities. And because this is a cohort, this is a grouping, they're all within a median of values, but there are some that are above and some are below. And so, you know, not every single place looks exactly like its colleagues. And here's the statistics, the top line data. $108 a square foot, right in that Goldilocks range. The velocity of sales, statistics show that between 6 and 7% really is, 6 and 8% is really sort of, they call it the Goldilocks range for velocity. And that's really important because you want to be seeing homes coming up and homes selling and closing each year. So 6.68 is right in a healthy spot. Low foreclosure, high owner occupancy, old homes, you know, really old homes, which means if the values are strong, they're being kept up. Certainly some of the high quality places to live. Here's Cleveland. So this is the geographic version of that bar graph chart where we saw that they all dropped off the middle. There's our city. So as we discussed with the bar graph, we want to work on the edge. We want to start focusing on these areas that are close. And so we have two cohorts, the declining and the weak middle markets in Cleveland. And so here's our next grouping. And this starts to show you those gateway communities, as some people call them, these middle markets as others. Our mayor calls them stable communities, right? We all have our different terms. We don't need a term. We can show you a map and show you exactly where the cohort of sort of this declining middle markets are. West Park, Bel Air Puritas, Collinwood, Lee Harvard, and then their municipal sort of cousins, Bedford, Maple Heights, and Parma, Cleveland Heights, and South Euclid. To my colleagues in the first suburbs, you know exactly what I'm describing and what we're talking about. And when you look at the values, something really significant stands out. At $78 a square foot as the median, we're looking at approximately $30,000 gap between where the prices of the homes are typically selling and where we want to see stability take place. And so when we look at our policy tools, and we'll get to that at the end of the conversation, the construction gap financing program, which is operating out of the City of Cleveland Community Development Department as we speak, provides up to $30,000 or up to $40,000, I believe, dollars for acquisition rehab development of properties. And so it makes me very happy to see that the data and the policy are aligning well. We know that these homes are close. And we know that the City of Cleveland, with its limited resources, has developed a program that can solve this problem. And so I work with some great people at the City of Cleveland, and we're trying our best to make it an expeditious and thoughtful program that can really intake this challenge, which is the acquisition cost of a home and the investment into it doesn't appraise. And if we overinvest into it, then it only goes deeper. But if we want to see healthy, quality, affordable housing in these markets, we need to subsidize. One thing that's also very interesting is that at $30,000, these are actually a less expensive subsidy than the tax abatement process that we use as one of our residential subsidies in other neighborhoods. And so this is actually a very inexpensive way to invest in these communities. Owner occupancy is high, foreclosures very low. These are really stable places. And 10 or 15 years ago, they probably would have been in the last cohort, but they started to hit that decline. So this is an area we want to target. And this last cohort that we want to focus on, we call the weak middle markets. There's simply another sort of step down on that path. Bel Air Puritas, Old Brooklyn, Lee Harvard, and Collinwood. And then you can see the municipalities are slightly different. We've got Garfield Heights, Maple Heights, and Bedford, and Cleveland Heights and South Euclid. There's also something that's really important to understand about this particular cohort. As you can see there, the median price per square foot, $65. It's about $13 fewer than the last cohort and about maybe $20,000 or so. These neighborhoods and these block groups tend to have a considerably higher proportion of Black and brown residents in them. And so we know that the truth of this slide is not that these are really weaker markets than the declining middle markets. What we know is that these are communities that are simply showing weaker values because of the history of redlining, because of the history of redlining that has led to de facto redlining. Every day we still hear about appraisers that will simply give a lower value to an identical home because the portraits on the walls are of a Black family. Again, we are very well aware that this is not just a problem, but this is absolutely the injustice of our housing market. And when we're designing a tool and a program to work in these places, we've made the conscious decision that these markets and the prior slide are one and the same. That when we're working in the city of Cleveland, there is absolutely no difference between a Black and a white neighborhood, majority at least, when the data shows us there is. Because we know that that's absolutely not true, and we need to find ways to make that targeted challenge improved. And so what's fascinating about this is actually that we still have pretty strong owner occupancy and low foreclosure rates. Again, they look almost identical to the last cohort we saw. They just seem to have sort of destabilized further because of that history. And so this shows us our middle markets. And as I mentioned before, this tool is a universal tool. And so while you can see the county, here's our middle markets of Northeast Ohio, as though there was no such thing as a municipal border, but there it is, city of Cleveland. And it's a migration story, like I said, people moving from one place to another. It kind of comes across as stark, but anyone who's lived in Collinwood or now lives in Euclid will tell you this is exactly right. This is where people and the markets have moved. I will quickly show the remaining cohorts just to give a sense of what we're talking about. Here is our A typology. $18 a square foot median. Foreclosure rate is considerably higher, the highest of any of the cohorts. Still relatively modest owner occupancy rates, extremely old housing stock. Now, that doesn't just mean that the housing stock is old. It also means that there isn't a new housing going on that's creating an averaging. And here we have the B category, median household income, median price per square foot at $40 a square foot, just about, higher owner occupancy. These are the areas, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we want to be able to push our CDBG allocations, our HUD funding, and our programs in the city really to stabilize these places with a different toolkit. And then it's the divided city, right? We have, this is the E typology is what the computer tells us. Those of us that know the city know quite a bit of what we're looking at. There's some surprises that I found, particularly interesting. But as you look at University Circle in Midtown, you look at CAMS, you look at obviously downtown in the near West Side. I want to make sure that sort of the last explanation of this slide is this is not just housing values. In fact, if you look at the median price per square foot, it's actually lower than the stable middle because there's such a wide variety in this group. This group is defined not just by housing values, but it's defined by that walkable retail component and housing values and a variety of other things that show that these places have, if you look at the region, places like Lakewood pop up in this cohort, places like Cleveland Heights pop up in this cohort. None of the outer ring suburbs show up in this area. These are really places that are vibrant. That's a vibrant cohort. And there's something that we can really use as anchors as we look to potentially find where we're going to work on our communities. So that's how we determined the broad middle markets of Cleveland. And the next step was figuring out where we were going to go ahead and invest. So as you can see here, we started on the west side. We did obviously both sides of our city to do a street by street analysis. And we started by parcel analysis 2014 to 2019. And you're seeing really strong housing market here. So 350 and above, 200, 350, very, very high value homes. 150 to 200 is where we've hit the top end of that stable range. And you can see parts of Old Brooklyn, parts of West Boulevard and CAMS showing up here. The orange is sort of the bread and butter of what we want to be focusing on. The orange is where we believe there's market space to invest. And then under $80,000 arm's length transactions, just to make sure that we all understand when we're looking at a market, there's a market happening everywhere. It just may not be occurring at a level where we see economic dividends. So here we can overlay the typology that's showing what we're really talking about on a street by street level with the market analysis. And here is the whole picture. And so it really kind of allows us to then zoom in and look block by block and try to find those places that are the lingering stable places. On the east side, we have the same scenario, 350 and above. We've got some in University Circle and some in Glenville. 2 to 350, we see more in the Circle North Glenville, a lot in Huff and Fairfax around the clinic. 150 to 200, you see some at the development in Slavic Village and more around Glenville. Excuse me. And then when we bring the orange in, we can start to see these middle communities. You see them popping up in Lee Harvard and sort of Shaker Square, Larchmere, and certainly North Collinwood. And when we bring it all together, again, our middle neighborhoods line up with these places. So the data is sort of speaking to itself, and that just helped us validate what we were working with. So we wanted to go deeper. Old Brooklyn, we said, was a neighborhood with a bunch of different housing typologies. So we'll use it as an example today just to show everyone how we went to the street level. Because at the end of the day, I want to be clear, we have picked streets, we have picked blocks. These are places where we want to start piloting programs. And part of this involved conversations with our CDCs and our neighborhoods. And also part of it was this analysis. So it's important to be transparent and show how we worked on all of this. And so as you can see here, when you look at the neighborhood and you start to get a sense, remember, orange is that bread and butter, but you want to be working in a place where there's a lot of opportunity. You can't just be working in a place where there's a little bit of housing stock moving in that direction. And it also helps to have stronger housing values as well. And so one of the rules, one of the sort of the Bible of middle neighborhoods is to build from strength. Our goal is to radiate beyond the initial pilots, of course, but we have to build from something. And so you can take a look. Here's one block group, $87 a square foot. The whole of the neighborhood I mentioned was around $74,000 for the average home. So we're looking at around $58 or so a square foot. So this is a stronger part of the community. And that helps us realize we've got to get down to the block groups. So we talked with the CDC, we sat down, had a conversation, and we started to kind of take a look at what these places looked like on the ground. We walked all of these streets. And as you can see in this deep maroon, what made these places stand out was that they were actually developments in the 1960s and some in the 1990s and 2000s. They were developed in areas that had been formerly large-scale greenhouse farms, part of the history of this part of the city of Cleveland. And so while they are very interesting sort of cul-de-sacs and 1960s ranches and things like that, they weren't part of the continuous street grid that we really wanted to be looking at. These two areas showed us sort of a strong middle and a weaker middle. And when we then moved around nearby, we saw that there was a precipitous fall off and a weaker community just northwest of this area. The CDC shared with us their plans for Pearl Road and for Broadview Road and the development they were working on. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone was talking the same language, everyone was in the room. And so as we discussed it, we realized that this area in transition really was a smart focus point. And as you can see, we're getting very granular, very small, just under 1,000 properties. That's the way we want to start. We want to find areas that we can analyze house by house, whether it's working with our HHI coordinators in the area or the CDCs, whether it's working with seniors or other nonprofits. We want to bring to bear resources in such a small area that we can really see an impact and move the needle. And we want to do this every way. So we're working with Director Ebersol's shop at Economic Development to talk about making these Main Street, Great Street zones. We're talking with our team here in community development about SRP and ways that we can sort of underscore the use of the program and actually expand its availability in these areas. We also need to do some just general community development mapping and understand where there are unique assets. There's a school in this area. There are some land bank lots and properties that are standing out. You can see here in pink, the land bank lots. And then finally, just since we're all not together on a bus, we'll walk through this area together. That's west side of the street, Tampa Ave, moving across the street, Tampa Ave, and then finally, just a little bit further down the street, from east to west, you could throw a baseball if you had a good arm. And I say that because that is really the hallmark of where we want to do our work, where we want to bring to bear our resources. And so at the end of the day, we were able to come up with these large neighborhood level areas that fall into our middle territories, and then come up with pilot places where we can work, and to show everyone what these demographics really look like, what the areas really look like. They match a lot of the necessary places of Cleveland where we want to invest, but they are relatively stronger than the fully distressed parts of our community. So I'll take a pause there. We're getting close to 11:12, and I want to get into some of the interventions, but I want to give an opportunity if there are questions.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, we do have 2 questions in the chat. The first one from Tom says, does your definition of the various neighborhoods include an assessment of the strength of the commercial, meaning multifamily housing and retail structures in the neighborhoods?
Yes, and so within the analysis tool that we've been showing here, there are, I think, 24 commercial variables that are included. Now, something that we couldn't include, and believe me, over the last 2 years of working with Case, I think they're getting to the point where they're done working on this conversation, but we wanted to figure out, was there any way to bring in sort of that anecdotal component? Because you might have tens of thousands of square feet of neighborhood retail that are vacant, or you might have tens of thousands of square feet of neighborhood uh, retail that are thriving. And then you can have places that are neither vacant nor thriving, and they all sort of show up in terms of code. They all sort of show up in terms of the way that they are logged in NST similarly. And so unfortunately, we don't have yet, and I actually would be very interested in hearing if there are ideas of how we could include, as we grow this tool and define it, the commercial side even more. But the big thing that we wanted to make sure was that when we looked at areas, and that's why that E category, that purple maroon, that was sort of the near west side downtown, but then elsewhere, the thing that came up, we have sort of variables that are the most descriptive of a place. The variable that was number one on that list was not home values or velocity of sales, but it was actually the commercial corridor activity and the vibrancy. And what we looked for was a variety of codes. So codes that showed retail that was at storefront level, places that had walk-up apartments, small scale multifamily, and density and size and scale. And then we also took industrial uses and other things, and we used them as sort of a negative indicator along major corridors. And then the computer told us where there was a lot of that. And that's why you'll see Madison in Lakewood creating a similar typology to Lorraine in Ohio City.
Thank you. One more question from Casey, and this might actually come up in your part 4. But the question is, how many buyers or owners have used the gap financing program in Cleveland, and where? If the effort was more concentrated, would it not be more successful revitalizing a middle neighborhood?
To your second point, absolutely. Concentration is the key. And that's why I took a large portion of this presentation to take us all the way from neighborhood level, massive geographies, all the way down to blocks. If you go to the Healthy Neighborhoods Inc. website, that's Baltimore's nonprofit that works in middle neighborhoods, they have a loan tool that people can use. And if you look at the loan tool, they'll have eligibility areas. And they actually will say that the 1900 block of Douglas Road is eligible, meaning only 30, 40 houses on a street are eligible because they are working at such a concentrated level to make sure that the resources are getting used and creating that domino effect. In terms of how many dollars have gone out to the construction gap financing program out of the city is actually for developers, nonprofit developers or for-profit developers, and they have to be sold to homeowners when they're done, so they can't be used as rentals afterwards. I don't have the numbers in front of me of how many individual projects have been done. It's fewer than a dozen at this point, and I'll be completely honest, we're slower to get these projects moving than we want to be. The Middle Neighborhoods Initiative that I manage will be hopefully taking some of the funds and resources and be using them to direct them, and we'll try to make this more expeditious. We do have a couple projects that lumber prices over the last 6 months while we've been working with permitting and such has actually caused the scope to go beyond the gap that we initially gave. So we're very cognizant of how much we need to make this a fast process at the city.
Jason, I know you're going to get to interventions, but I had a quick, I guess it's a question comment. I got really stuck for a moment when you were talking about appraisers and how appraisers can impact the health of a neighborhood, let's just say. Is there any policy that we can work on as a shared community, or will you be making presentations or bringing this program to the realtor and appraiser community? Because I think it's incredibly helpful to do so.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. So my set of conversations over the last 2 years have been with CDCs, banks, and realtors. A couple of times appraisers. To be honest, appraisers can be, and if there's any on our call, I mean this lovingly, but they can be a little squirrely. And there's a reason for that. The Dodd-Frank Act and the impact of the late 2000s and the housing crisis and the Great Recession intentionally made appraisals sort of blind to the banks. The idea was that they didn't want there to be much of a subjectivity to the appraisals. Obviously, in those years, that was because appraisals were going as high as possible, because as long as you had some sort of income, the highest price they could get for the home was what the bank wanted. We all know what they were doing and selling the mortgages. And so the appraisals were skyrocketing. And so one of the things that the federal government did was try to find a way to make sure that the appraisals were as objective as possible. Anyone who's ever looked at data and then looked at their street knows that that unfortunately has negatively impacted our communities and a lot of communities around here, because at the end of the day, most appraisals are heavily reliant on comps. And comps are simply a historic image. And so if you're walking down a street in Bel Air Puritas, and I've had conversations with homeowners that have gone through this, and it's heartbreaking because they will put a bid on a home, they will offer the full price, and then the appraisal comes in at $15,000 less. And when that appraisal comes in at $15,000 less, because it's only using comps within the neighborhood around it, it's only using sales from the past couple of years, it's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're stuck in a situation where the down payment plus the cash they need to gap that appraisal is simply too much. And so a tool that we've been working on will actually help overcome those appraisal gaps by developing a high LTV tool that allows people in middle neighborhoods to buy homes at their prices. And even if there is a modest appraisal gap, get in. We think that will create the necessary domino effect to allow comps to catch up. And I'd be happy to talk with your director of public policy and start having conversations about this at a higher level next. All right. I'm going to go ahead because we've got a little bit of time left and I want to make sure we get into interventions. The reason why, by the way, the interventions are at the end and we're not showcasing all of them is because right now I'm excited to share that we're really at the first point of putting them out there. The Cleveland Foundation generously has provided us with funding for the next 2 years, specifically to move on pilot programs. These will be small scale, but we'll be putting out some RFPs through CNP, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, to allow for our CDCs to start coming up with ideas to solve your problems. You in these middle neighborhoods know these places even better than I do in most cases, and we want you to work with us to use extremely flexible funding to kind of figure out ways to fix this. One example is the appraisal challenge. One thing we could do is use our housing managers and CDCs to start developing relationships with those appraisals, start doing education, not to help the prices appreciate exponentially, but just to make sure that the value of these properties is not steadily declining. So a comprehensive middle neighborhoods toolkit brings to bear all available resources. And we're working right now on stimulus funding. A lot of people have been asking me about the stimulus funding. The Middle Neighborhoods Initiative did put in a request to the development cluster and to the mayor to request funding that would help us do things like the construction gap program so we can do more concentrated efforts and move it more quickly, as well as a lot of the other programs we want to bring to bear. So lending has to happen. We need to unclog the slow and declining lending in these markets. And these subsidies from the public side, whether it's tax abatement, credits, or financing, is another way to tell the private market that this is a movement. This is a place that has a higher value than is being understood. We also want to make sure that we can provide flexible dollars to the organizations that are doing this work, whether it's white boxing a property instead of simply purchasing it and then looking to find a developer partner, whether it's doing entrepreneurial supports and activities to create a pipeline so that when we have a property, we also have the small business to go along with it. We want to be able to bring those resources to bear. That's a little more of a stimulus bill kind of dollar amount. Model Block, which we're bringing back, very excited to have snagged Tony Bango from the CDC sector, who's doing a really wonderful job exploring middle neighborhoods and distressed communities all over the city of Cleveland to find ways to do this Model Block program. And I'm very excited to be working with him. SRP, the storefront renovation program, works well. Collinwood right now has a dedicated consultant along the 185th corridor. She's doing an incredible job, and we want to bring that same level of sort of needle work to these corridors. Lorraine in the 120s, Broadview, Lee Harvard, and 185. And then something that we've kind of borrowed from some other cities, and it's really aspirational, but we believe that infrastructure is going to be critical. When we have these maps, this only works if planning, economic development, community development, the CDCs, if everyone knows that we're talking about these places. I want to be clear, we're not talking about funneling resources away from other places. We're talking about when we do projects in these areas that we do understand how valuable the time and attention to detail is. We can't be having own goals in these areas. We need to make sure that we're doing the work. And then we want to find ways to kind of segment these strategies. So for example, we're going to be using some of our grant funding to do a lot of community engagement in some of the weaker communities. That's because of what I mentioned earlier at the very beginning. The gap of engagement leads to a gap of civic pride. We know that if we can help connect residents and build more trust, whether it's between the CDCs or the government and our residents, then when we bring resources to bear, when we talk about model block, that people will buy in. If there's no buy-in, then it doesn't matter how many dollars we have. In the more stagnant communities, we're going to start layering in those CDBG tools. We have very low and moderate income residents in all of these places, so they're very much eligible. And then in the more stable middle communities, the areas that we've identified as our primary initial targets, we're excited to talk about a high LTV lending tool that I'll make sure to get to just before we close out this morning. This is what I was talking about a moment ago, policies addressing the gaps. We've got one at the city. I talked about the construction gap financing. And for those of you that don't know, I think all of us should know at this point, we're all on the same listservs around Northeast Ohio. CCLRC, the land bank, has a new construction single family home gap subsidy program. And I've already seen this go into effect in a couple of neighborhoods. In fact, we have the first new construction on a street in Old Brooklyn since the 1990s. It's incredibly exciting because we're going to show the neighbors who have lived in these communities for a long time that they're in a community where people are attracted to it. And that's really important for civic pride. It's important for home values, but it's also important to send messages to our communities. We will be continuing to find ways to use those HUD dollars, but as I said at the onset, the goal of this is to release those dollars to where they're most needed. We want to bring to bear private investment. We want to get sort of the motor going in these communities, and then we want to let them sort of thrive on their own. We know we can do it because this happens in other parts of Cleveland. We have success stories, and so we just want to build a few more of those. And then this last slide is really sort of the crowning achievement of our 2 years of work. I told you we steal the best ideas from Baltimore. Healthy Neighborhoods, Inc. has a high LTV loan tool that's very much like the 203K or the Fannie Mae home style. It allows someone to buy a home and immediately, on the second half of the mortgage, immediately invest above the value of the home into the property. This allows them to put a new roof on, to put a kitchen in, to cover an appraisal gap. And what we've seen in Baltimore is that in areas where they've had this overinvestment, the appraisals when refinancing is done or when new appraisals are done immediately show not just that the gap has gone, but that the profitability has occurred. To Colleen's question a moment ago, at the end of the day, it's not that these places aren't intrinsically valued. It's not that they're being undervalued because of things that you're seeing in the communities. It's simply because we use old numbers and data from 5-10 years ago that continues to precipitate in the market to determine the current value. And so we need to start kind of pulling forward investment. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we have a lot of millennials who choose, if they can't afford neighborhoods they want in Cleveland, to move outside of Cleveland. But we do hear conversations with people that they want to buy in some of our sort of middle places. They're interested, they're intrigued. Realtors that want to push people to look in these places, and a lot of people that are sort of surprised and excited. And they want to buy these homes, and they're willing to immediately put in that new kitchen or that half bathroom that they need on the first floor. So by developing this tool, the city of Cleveland put $1 million into a loan loss reserve, which acts as a backstop to allow our financial sector partners to pool money. And those funds, which will be pooled and administered by a CDFI that will be putting an RFP out later this spring, they will provide people with no PMI, no fees, no HUD inspector costs. You'll be able to buy a home, invest in it, make it perfect to how you'd like it, and start your life in a city neighborhood. And so I'll pause there and take any last questions we have.
Jason, there aren't any questions in the chat, but I wanted to share something with you. Throughout the presentation, I've received so many private chat messages as well as text messages, and there's a common theme among them, and the fact that this is so smart. And I want to say, you are so smart. I'm sure you know that, but I want to reiterate that. And your commitment to raising the conversation around Cleveland middle neighborhoods and about the importance of middle neighborhoods, putting data behind it, and advocating for dollars, and congratulations for getting them in this past year. And thank you to the Cleveland Foundation for realizing and supporting this important work, as well as the administration and to Cleveland City Council. So on behalf of those who have sent me messages about this being so smart and necessary, I say thank you to you for this presentation today. And again, your commitment to this work. We have recorded this session. We will be making it available for folks that couldn't join us today or had to hop off at today's workshop to refresh themselves or pick up where they left off or learn new about Cleveland's middle neighborhoods. With no questions, I will bring us to a close. And again, thank you, Jason Powers, for enriching us today and for sharing the work that you so diligently have led over the last few years. We hated losing you from the CDC community, but we love where you are and we love what you're doing. So thank you very much. Folks, thanks for joining us today, and please be on the lookout for a session that will be coming up in May. We'll be hosting a session around what makes great boards specifically for CDC, so watch your inboxes for that. And then in June, we are planning a session around aging in place and the importance of elder-friendly communities. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon. Take care.